Thank you everybody for showing up for today's webinar. This is the Alaska chapter of A4LE, and we're very excited about today's informative topic. It's very timely with schools and our changing environment up here in Alaska and across the Arctic in general. Before I forward this on to Dale, Rick, and Ed, I'd like to first thank our sponsors for the year. These are our platinum and gold sponsors, and without their help, we wouldn't be able to be making these things possible. So we greatly appreciate everything that they do for the chapter. If you have ideas on future webinars that we can do, or you want to put your logo up there on the screen as well for the next webinar, please contact the chapter and we will make that happen. Speaking of future webinars, we have another webinar coming up next month in mid-July regarding cross-laminated timber and how that is being used in rural school projects. So stay tuned and we'll get the announcement out on that one next. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Dale and the team.
Thank you, Craig. This is Dale Smythe, Senior Architect with Bettesworth North. I've got two of the key team members on this project here to share what we've been doing over the last couple of years. Rick Mitchells from Golder is a geotechnical engineer, and Ed Yarmack, owner of Arctic Foundations, both key in helping us figure out what was going on in Nunam and how to solve it. So I wanted to start out quickly with just an introduction. Some folks have been to Nunam Iqua, some have worked there, some have never even heard of it or been to Alaska. Nunam Iqua is a very unique place in the world, and it's unique in Alaska. Represents a lot of what's happening in western Alaska. This slide, I wanted to share just where it is. It's 500 miles west of Anchorage, within the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge. Is right at the mouth of the Yukon River, as parts of the Yukon River as it comes out. There's no barge service, no road service. It is barge and air only. I think you can see Russia from this place. The point being, it is very far west and difficult to get to. Also, to kind of frame where it sits in this delta, it's very wet. Not a lot of dry land and not a lot of unfrozen land. We'll get more into this. But the challenges of not only building here or getting material here were paramount. The school site itself sits within Nunam. The site was selected based on many things. A lot of these rural schools have challenges with, A, is it an available site to build on? Does it have road or boardwalk access? Does it have utilities available? All of the things were part of the site selection on this. And quickly, I was lucky enough to be involved as a staff member on this project the 10-plus years ago through its development, and got to see some of the history of it, which is really the unique part for me as we get into the development of this. So that's where I'm bringing my perspective. As we got into how we were going to build this school, again, this re-emphasizes where we sit in Alaska within the areas of permafrost. You can see Nunam Iqua is in a very tenuous location of sporadic. It's even beyond the discontinuous area. So part of the effort in locating this particular school when it was originally designed in 04, 05 was considering the conditions of the ground, was that we actually physically pounded rods in through the tundra to find an ice lens on this site and then locate the footprint of the school on that ice lens as being predictably the most stable ground available. So that got us into what you see here, some of the original construction documents. The school sits on a pad of gravel that is built over insulation, which is over a subbase that houses thermal siphons to keep the ground cool. So I'm going to let Rick get much more into the details of putting a building on this challenging ground.
Thanks, Dale. This is Rick Mitchells. I'm with Golder Associates. My prior boss, Dwayne Miller, before he retired and sold the company, was the geotechnical engineer of record for this project, and I assisted him with siting and the geotechnical components to it. As with all projects out in remote Alaska, in particular this one, there are no sand and gravel material sources. So for those of you who work in areas where sand and gravel is readily available, every ounce of material for a pad had to be imported on a barge and handled twice, if not 3 times, before it was placed at this location. So what would be a somewhat manageable cost elsewhere becomes a major constraint and consideration for remote Alaska. We went out and did geotechnical borings. That would include soil sampling, laboratory testing. Paramount to that was ground temperature measurements to try to come up with an optimal solution for the foundations for the structure. All that work was completed. At the end of the day, we found, yes, indeed, it is ice-rich material. It is very intolerant to thaw. If it begins to thaw, there could be dramatic settlements. We call those thaw strains on the order of 30 to 60%. So what was an original 1-foot volume would be 6 inches or less of that. So it was paramount that we maintain the underlying in-place soils in a firm, frozen state. We looked at a couple of options for the foundations, including pile-supported and with blow-through space, and as what was actually designed and constructed, a engineered pad with cooling systems put under them, rigid insulation. There's a section here that gives you an idea of what that looked like. A critical feature, the critical component to this is draw your attention to the side slopes around what we call the skirt, or the slopes coming off of it. The albedo gain, the solar gain, is dramatic and increasing on these areas. So although we can come up with a good insulation and fill section under the building, it's the side slopes that also are critical to the design, so for your future thought processes. Another element to this I mentioned before is we had to import every ounce of gravel. And it would be nice to have a 10-foot thick pad and all this, but that comes obviously at a huge capital cost. So Dwayne Miller, when he designed this component, did something a little bit counterintuitive to what we learned in our Cold Regions Arctic Engineering program, in that he added a small amount of bentonite into the gravel fill, which is a good, clean, non-frost susceptible material. And counterintuitive in the sense that, well, why am I making something a bit more frost susceptible when I'm paying to bring in a good, clean material? And the reasoning is his process was to retain a little bit more moisture in the material, in the fill material below the rigid insulation, to add a buffer on the latent heat side. So if it was a good, clean, dry gravel, summer heat would transfer rapidly through this material. Adding a little bit of bentonite to it and blending it in would retard that. And hats off to the contractor, because when we designed it, we thought it'd be a nice 72-degree day with no rain. And in reality, it was about 35 degrees and blowing horizontal wind, and a bag of bentonite was a challenge to get blended in. And the contractor did an admirable job with that.
So moving on, one of the unique things about this particular project, unique to schools in Western Alaska, not unique to buildings completely, but if I'm correct, this is the only school in Western Alaska at grade with thermal siphon as the cooling method, correct, Ed?
Well, there's lots of different types of thermosiphons, Dale, and this particular design is unique to Nunam Iqua out here with the bentonite and the gravel and the sloping evaporator thermosiphons underneath. Basically, thermosiphon technology it's a very simple system. It's been in service since about 1960. I know some of the people on the participant list know quite a bit about thermosiphons, but I'm sure there's some on there that don't. And so just a basic thermosiphon 101, you can learn about everything right here. It's basically a closed tubular vessel, so it's a pipe with closed ends. There's a two-phase working fluid inside, so that just means there's something inside so that there's liquid and vapor at the same time. So, and then, and only that working fluid. It's installed so that the top part, which we call the condenser, is out in the outdoor air, and that the bottom part, which is the evaporator, is in ground. The illustration next door is a vertical straight thermosiphon, and you can see how that works there, or how it looks. At Nunam Iqua, the thermosiphon evaporator, the in-ground part, just has an L in it, and the evaporator shoots underneath the school. So for these things to work, whenever the air outside gets cold, below the soil temperature, the vapor inside condenses at the top, and that releases heat to the air. And that the condensation inside slightly reduces the internal pressure, and it causes the inside to boil. And that boiling liquid absorbs heat from the ground. And then the condensate that comes down from the fins re-evaporates anytime it comes into contact with something warm. And then it just keeps moving until the air warms up. And it moves heat only against gravity. It will not move heat down. It's a one-directional heat flow device.
So, and then, Ed, I think the most amazing thing, that's what you see here, the thermal siphons running under the building, and you can see in these drawings the pattern that covers all areas below the slab and the outline of the building. The entire thing is cooled. And I think for me, as a layperson, recognizing or being introduced to this technology in the beginning, what's amazing is this is all passive. There's no energy that goes in once the system is pressurized and in place. And I think as long as the air temperature is below freezing, this equipment's doing its job. So again, I've been involved in this project. I was a staff member in the beginning, and then I would stay in touch because I thought it was just such a fascinating project, and I would see the people from the school district at conferences and ask them how the project was going, and try and get an update on it, because I had not been able to get to the project since it was constructed. And on about 7 or 8 years after completion, the folks in the school district would tell me, well, we've got a little bit of settling. There's some movement in a curtain wall, some aluminum frame in the library. Oh, man, you'd hate to hear that, right? As any team member on a project, the settlement in this location was always a risk, no matter how well the design was done, things that you couldn't control in construction, all kinds of other things that were potential elements to cause settlement. So maintaining those, it was actually fairly minor for a number of years, and not until about 3 years ago, in discussion with the school district, they said something has changed. We've got some dramatic settlement. It's more than before. We need to start having somebody come look at that. So we obviously engaged Rick again and tried to make a plan of how to attack this. And the three major elements were assess the current condition. You know, obviously wanted to make sure there were no life safety issues with electrical or plumbing coming disconnected that could cause issues, settlement with the structure that would threaten the students or the structure itself. So we sent some engineers from Kaufman out to help us with the mechanical elements. Reed Middleton, Robert Karuna went out and looked at the structural. And then with Rick's help, got the core drillers in and made a plan to how are we going to assess the temperature of the system underneath. That led us to a full investigation of the waste lines. We got Pinnacle out and Drain Masters to help us video every single waistline we could get to. And then the plan was, listen, we think we've got melting, and we've got to refreeze it, we've got to stabilize this building, and then repair the damage. That's getting a little ahead of us, though. I think what I wanted to show you was at the time we came into the project, here's a topographical survey we did inside the building, just like you do for elevations outside of the site. And this is a bit exaggerated, but it does show up to 6 inches difference between the red areas are the lowest portions of this building and the green being the highest. This visually was a great tool for us to use to see how the settlement had occurred and how that might indicate where it was coming from. With that, I'll let Rick jump into how he helped us actually go in and further figure out what was going on.
Thanks, Dale. Hey, can you go back one slide, Dale? So it's a little bit congested on this slide, but a little preface to what we actually went out and did in the field. The question came up when we started hearing about settlement is what is the root cause or nature of the settlement? And the initial thoughts were, oh my gosh, the foundations are moving, the building is seeing structural movement around the edge. A couple of site reconnaissance effort and then some topographic survey work, a review of the design and the as-built plans indicated, no, the perimeter of the building is actually pretty darn stable. It's an all-heated structure, full-on heated year-round. So we started shifting our gears a little bit, saying, well, maybe there's something else going on. And we took a closer, deeper dive into the design documents and started dialing in on this kitchen area, which is right, well, it's hard to see where it's at. I mean, you can point to that, Dale. Kitchen area, there's a lot of mechanical buried below the slab, but above the rigid insulation. Then along the planned east-west corridor is a lot of mechanical installed there. And what's a bit unique about this particular project is the mechanical is a gravity drain for waistlines. And due to elevation and slope, and going back to my prior discussion about the need for cost of imported gravel, the waistlines, the heated waistlines do penetrate through the rigid insulation layer and extend down into the fill material below that. The intent of the design is to maintain all materials below the rigid insulation, both fill and in-place soil, in a fully frozen state throughout the service life of the structure. So it started raising some red flags, and we said, maybe we should take a little closer look at this. Next slide, please. And we came up with a plan of attack to maybe let's get some holes in the ground where we see through the slab where we have the worst of the problems. Now, for those who have been to a remote Alaska school, this is probably secondhand photos for you. But for those who haven't, the schools are remarkable. They're architecturally appealing. They're structurally sound. And they are very, very heavily used by the community. It is the focal point for the community. So our task and mission before us was to conduct our work, yet keep the building live and safe throughout the whole process we're doing that. And I want to start off right off the bat and compliment our geotechnical drilling contractor, which is Geotech Alaska. They just did a fabulous job of working around tight schedules and working in the evenings and weekends and being very courteous and above all being very safe. The picture on the left is the first thing we did is this is looking down that long planned east-west corridor. We got a set of drawings that said these are where the utilities, buried utilities are, but we're like, well, is that where they really are? Because the last thing we want to do is drill through one of them. So this is a GPR unit that we brought out to verify utilities, and lo and behold, there were a few anomalies that came up that were not shown on the plan.
GPR stands for?
Ground penetrating radar. Sorry about that. It's a lawnmower. You run it up and down the hall. It's real-time imaging, obviously non-destructive, but it helped us to fine-tune where we were going. Anything was anomaly, we just did not go there to drill for fear of hitting something that was not on either the design plans or the as-built. Slide on the right, first thing is the core. It's a little bit of wet coring with a wet vac to get through the topping and then the concrete slab itself. Next slide. Go the other way. This gives you an idea of the system that the drilling contractor put together, all hydraulically driven. There is no exhaust inside the building. Power pack was located outside. It was gasoline driven, away from any intake or ventilation issues. We were able to reach about 120 feet from the power pack inside the building. The rest of the things in the photo on the left are just means and methods for sampling. The one on the right is taken within the kitchen area. It is a bit congested in there, and we were asked to obviously keep it very neat and clean, and so they could still use this facility after we were done. Next slide. After coring, drilling, sampling, we installed some small diameter closed-in PVC standpipes. These were used for soil temperature measurements, ground temperature measurements after we were done. And the one on the right is the finished product with a accessible monument on the top, flush so there weren't any tripping hazards, site mopped up, cleaned up, and fully usable for the school. Give you an idea of what we brought up. The picture on the left is a conventional soil split spoon sampler. The material on the left hand, the pink material is the rigid insulation that was buried in the slab, or buried below the slab in the fill. The material to the left of that is the granular fill that was imported that is above the rigid insulation, and that was fully intended to be unfrozen throughout the service life of the structure, and indeed it was. The photo on the right is below the foam insulation, and that was all supposed to be frozen solid. And as you can see, there's an awful lot of water in there and an awful lot of material that we would not want to thaw out. So, summary on this is the nature of the beast was there is a heat source coming down through the utilities, and it is thawing out material below the rigid insulation. And the investigation process was to get both the vertical, horizontal extent of that and a corrective action with that.
So the next step then was also, so we verified that we did have thawing happening under the school that was leading to this settlement. Part of the investigation effort, they found waste lines that had disconnected and were allowing hot water to come from the kitchen dishwasher. This is what we're supposing. We did find the separated waste lines, but that was causing the thaw. That we are still supposing that a water line, hot water line that was in the kitchen that ran below the slab had been leaking within the first few years, a slow leak, the first few years after construction that took this long to actually thaw the ground, cause settlement enough for those larger drains to separate, and then that was really what accelerated the settlement and caused the greatest concern and really the kickoff for this whole effort. So after that, the plumbing was repaired, the water line was shut off, so then it's, well, what do we do to restabilize the ground? And really the only option to do that is to refreeze it, and considering the timelines and the amount of thaw, the options were that it had to be actively refrozen. And I want to let Ed then talk about, he was able to verify on site that, and Rick, one key out of the investigation effort, sorry, this is the point I wanted to make, is of where we drilled, one major key is that the free field test location, which is actually out here, indicated that the area outside of the settlement, the foundation was functioning as designed.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct.
And that is a key component to this, that it wasn't a failure of the system, the way it was designed, or other influences, that it was actually this, what we're supposing is our heat source. So with that, Ed, we decided to actively refreeze.
Okay. And just a little bit before we decided to actively refreeze, we had sent a technician out there to inspect all the thermosiphons to make sure they were operating properly. And, we found all the units underneath the school were operating properly. Some might be a little bit warmer than we'd expect, but because of the array of thermosiphons that was at the project, as you can see, we've got condensers. Those are the round dots on that diagram. We've got condensers all over the outside of the building in different places. These are an old sloping evaporator system, not like some of the newer systems that are out today. And so we were constrained by the old system, so we looked at putting refrigerating 4 units in 3 different places to kind of get that middle of the building cooled off. The condensers or the mechanical condensing units were relatively small, little 2.5 horse, 208 volt 3-phase units, something that the school would be able to handle under their own power if need be. There's some photos here. You can see the one unit inside a protected cage to keep the kids' hands out of the fan. It's relatively small. The inside unit only weighs about 300 pounds. All the steel and everything around it weighs another couple hundred pounds. So they're fairly easy to transport around. In the lower left, you see how tall the condensers were at the school. And typically when we put these hybrid units on to make the units active, we take the condenser down and just put them in line. But there's no crane in Nunam Iqua. The only backhoe is in the middle of the sewage lagoon, and it's not working. And so we put these units on as sidecars on the side, and you can see a picture of the cooling unit on the side, and that's after it's been running for about a month. And there's insulation on the pipe, the black insulation on the cooling unit there. There's insulation on the pipe down below that, and then you can see a whole bunch of frost on the actual pipe that's not insulated. That's that bulb up there is the thermal expansion bulb. So there's we're running these things at about -10 or so Fahrenheit. The gauge up on the other side actually shows was an early run, and that's running right at -8 with R404A. It's just a direct expansion system. Take the next slide, please. Basically, this is how everything worked out there. We've got that the heat exchanger off to the side of the thermosiphon. The heavy black area is the insulation. Liquid feed from the active air-cooled condensing unit going into the thermal expansion valve, which limits the amount of liquid and expands it. And then we've got vapor return on the bottom. So essentially, we're just making the inside of that unit very cold. Inside of that unit, there is probably 35 to 40 square feet of very cold area for the CO2 refrigerant that's in the thermosiphon to condense on. So, it's equivalent to maybe having a pipe maybe 40 feet high up top. You can see let's go back up, and we used just an active air cooling direct expansion system, running 0 to -15 F. There was no glycols or brines to spill here. We definitely didn't want to have a system out here where the kids might climb on it accidentally cause a leak, not their fault, but then we have a big mess to clean up on the site. Okay, thanks.
So, and quickly, through the original design, the location of these thermal siphons coordinated with windows, that being above the roof was key to the ability for the thermal siphons to cool efficiently. And back to the original design, you know, we had done, as Rick was talking about, this pad there was a lot of effort put into how this was going to end up. How we could use material there. Thermal modeling was done, and this is all, you know, we're talking 04, 05. Not only a very different climate situation in Alaska compared to now with what was known, but different technologies for thermal modeling, everything was different. So it is, again, just amazing to see it back. One of the things that was incorporated into the original design, into the DDC system, the direct digital control system of the building, was soil temperature monitoring. And you can see an example here of what the system spits out. This is not constantly monitored. It logs it, and you can access a screen, but part of the challenges of this project is it wasn't being consistently monitored. And it also, as Rick will allude to more, that we're not sure where exactly all of these points are in the system. So this was one resource we used as soon as we were made aware of the issues, was to get in and try and log this data. Another system that was used, this is a thermistor string and data logger, an iPad that the teacher out in Nunam Iqua, John Dandridge, helped us with the students to go in, and some of those core holes that Rick and Geotech used to research the condition, we then used to help monitor. And John would take these measurements and send them back, and then Rick and Ed would analyze them to assess the progress of our cooling. Because one thing we didn't touch on, there was a massive volume of warm water that had thawed this. So that got us to our graph. And Rick, you want to tell us what this stuff means?
Sure. So the process to go through in consultation with Ed and his team and Kaufman and the rest of the design team is we have a fixed volume of soil we need to refreeze that for all our design purposes is fully saturated. So the name of the game is getting that latent heat released. So we worked carefully with Arctic Foundations to size the mechanical component to this because we knew it was only going to run for a limited period of time, basically through the winter. What's going to take to refreeze that water, which takes a tremendous amount of energy, and then reduce it down even more so that we have a little bit of a buffer on this. And these plots are just temperature results. Thank you, John, for sending them to us. He was the teacher that was able to retrieve this information for us. As Dale mentioned earlier, it's 500 miles away, so you just don't hop in a plane and go out there and get temperatures, so we really appreciate that. There are a series of locations where those PVC stand pipes were installed. The tops of the plots will show kind of where they're at, gym or lobby area. The dark line, the black line, was pre-freezing right around November, so we're getting a little bit of natural freezing to start, but generally it's before anything serious happened. The red line or orange line, as it shows up here, is right towards the end of the season, right about the middle of April. I think they ran like another month, I think, Ed, beyond that. So that's essentially as cold as they were going to get before we disconnected the systems where they were terminated. So on each of these, and one more note, the picture of the temperature sensing device that Dale showed earlier, the bead sensors were at 2-foot spacing, and all these temperatures have a linear interpolation between the beads, the nodes. So there's a little bit of, is it really that temperature between them, particularly when you get to the warmer side. So a little bit of latitude on it, but we're looking at depth. What's going on at depth? And remarkably, things cooled down just as was predicted with the Ticonderoga pencil and a little bit of software analysis, and they worked very well. Let's go to the next slide, take a look at them. Yeah, just another set. You can see the deep cooling. There was really deep thaw in the kitchen area. That's the plot on the left. almost 9 feet below the slab before we got back, and that's well into in-place materials. Nice, good refreezing of that, and because of the linear interpolation, it's frozen up to the bottom of the foam insulation. So worked very, very well. The last slide is the one that I think is the hallmark of the design. One more slide. This is a picture of the free field area that Dale had mentioned earlier. It is well outside the zone of influence of the mechanical cooling systems, and it reflects how is this rascal working independent of any, just by Mother Nature. And as expected, it's staying frozen. You know, the winter comes along, the blue line reflects towards the end of winter period cooling. So yes, it is nicely refreezing. Materials, keeping them frozen below the foam insulation. Appears to be a minor excursion above that, right below the foam, but it's well within the design tolerances of what we had. So we felt great vindication. In fact, I called up my former boss, Dwayne Miller, and said, yeah, you done good. You laid this thing out, you thought it through, and as this building, it's about halfway through its service life now, 2/3 of the way through. It's ticking the way it should. So hats off to Arctic Foundation. It's a great product, a good design, and it's worked well.
That was the best news, being involved in this thing from the beginning and now, and working with the school district and understanding what it would mean if it wasn't working. It was a massive relief. So getting into then, so we've done the research. We know, we believe we know what happened. We believe that the school has been restabilized and the ground is refrozen. And now what are we going to do about it? Because we do have, as you saw in some of the photos, we have cracked floor, we have unlevel floors. The school has been doing what they can to work around these challenges as much as possible, but it really needs to be repaired. So the repair process involved getting below the slab, repairing all of the waistline connections that we saw through the video efforts, and then re-leveling and new finishes. For the waistlines, you can see in this image, the kitchen is the most dramatic, or has the most of the waistlines to fix, and therefore requires the most concrete removal. And so keep in mind, we're removing and trying to remove and replace concrete in Nunam Iqua between the end of school and the start of school in one season. So that work was just put out to bid and and hopefully will be awarded shortly. But this shows the repair work in the kitchen, down the corridors, and then at one specific location at a pipe junction from the video analysis. Once the waistlines are repaired, and hopefully the intent is to get the smoking gun of the water line that we believe was leaking, we're going to pull that out and mount it on a wall like a trophy. But then the remainder is then to re-level the floor, the floors, repair doors, etc., new floor finishes, and repair cracks in the wall. It actually, coincidentally, a lot of the damage looks like the things that people are repairing in South Central from our most recent large earthquake. A lot of sheetrock cracking and then door adjustment. So this explains, though, the other elements that we've got to deal with. To repair the kitchen, we've got to remove all of the equipment, cut into the slab, do that waistline, then re-level, put new flooring in, and replace all the kitchen equipment. In the gymnasium, we've got to remove bleachers, remove finished floor, re-level, and even with no plumbing work in that area, then re-level and re-pour gym floor. So it affects nearly all of the school in some form or another. So it's not a small effort, and again, happening in Nunam Iqua this summer, hopefully. But so what I think the things that were to go back to, I want to touch on. We ran the condensers through last winter, starting in the late fall, there was concern without being able to predict the temperature of the winter, would we be able to refreeze and stabilize? And I think that was a huge decision from my standpoint for the school district to make, was to invest in that active cooling, to bring those condensers out and refreeze as our insurance that that ground would be frozen and stabilized to begin this repair work. None of the repair work could happen unless that was completed, and we got, what Rick and Ed just talked about, we got confirmation of that early this spring for this work to even happen. So there's all the repair work. I think to me, what this project in itself indicates is not that it's merely a water line leak in a school that thawed some permafrost. What you see in discussions about the Arctic and you see about schools specifically in Western Alaska is what does the future hold? And to me, this project was just an example. The repair of it represents, the cause of it might be one thing, but the repair of it represents a challenge that all of Western Alaska and all of other parts of the state will deal with, and I just wanted to spend a few moments with Rick and Ed to get their thoughts on that also, and what that means relative to this slide.
Well, thank you, Dale. This slide is not Nunam Iqua. It's a building similar. The date here, September 2066, doesn't really. It just means in the future sometime. But this is a similar structure, and we're looking at what happens with warming from climate change. In other words, when winters aren't as cold and summers are warmer, and we've got permafrost below us, where is this going to bite us? And it's going to bite us around the outside of the building. We can see here that we get thaw in the gravel, in the soils outside, that is going to be thaw and stable, and that is where a well-designed building is going to have its Achilles heel, in the future. But one thing we can do on our end, or one thing the owners can do, is they can, put in instrumentation and review this. Review the temperatures and stuff out there to see where this is going. You may not, there's ways to repair this as it's going along if you need to hold on to the building a little bit longer. So there's, it's just a good idea to see where things are coming from. Rick, you have...
Yeah, thanks, Ed. Just a few closing comments. As with all projects, it's the value to have a lessons learned. And the lessons learned takeaways for me were the quality of the design drawings was superb. They were laid out. It was clear where things were at. Where it got a little foggy and a little bit uncertain was on the as-built records. So as design professionals and as owners, I think a focus on making sure we have good, clean closeout documentation and accuracy of that is just invaluable when we start looking at projects and nature of problems. Second thing that comes to mind is owners are coming to us as design professionals and are constrained to have to extend the life of their existing structures well beyond what they were originally intended to do. And we, as design professionals, really need to sit down and work, I think, in conjunction with the owners and look at this instrumentation. The name of the game is to try to have a forecasting methodology at a very reasonable price so that before a crack shows up in a wall or a crack shows up in a building floor or a wall somewhere, that we can do some predictive work with it. With today's backbone communication systems throughout Alaska, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when this building was designed, that was impossible. Well, today it's not. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to have these discussions and what makes sense. And good, clean as-built records and good, clean instrumentation. I think those are really hallmarks to focus on. The quality of the designs, the quality of construction, it's all good stuff out there. We all know who we are. We all know we're all doing quality work, and we know the contractors are doing good work. I think this next step is the downstream post-construction monitoring.
That's fantastic. With that, I have to commend Ed and Rick. We have nailed our timing. It was absolutely perfect. We've tried to leave time for questions and answers. I believe text chat is the only way that folks can ask questions, and we've got that up here. If anyone has anything, I just want to say thanks again for letting us present, and everyone that called in. Craig, do you have more to add?
I think this was a fantastic presentation. Really want to appreciate Dale, Rick, and Ed's time in putting this together. If you do have questions, how you would do it is on your lower screen, you'll see a series of circles there. Click on the one that's got a person, which will be the participants, and then go over to Donna Robinson, who is our regional representative for A4LE, and she's the host of this webinar. So go over to Donna Robinson's name and go and click on the far right symbol, which will say Chat with Donna Robinson, and then you can type in your questions, and we'll read them and answer them. And I'll start off, I'll prime the pump with a question here. Is there anything that designers should be putting into their designs now, in under slab or anything like that, or CDC system, that we should be preparing for the eventuality of these soil conditions changing 50 years out? What should we be doing now that may not be seen as necessary, but we really should be doing?
This is Rick Mitchell's. 50 years out is a long window in Alaska. So maybe a first discussion on what's an appropriate and a phased process. I'll let Ed chime in too, but I think the number one thing we should be focusing on for these slab-on grades, in fact, any buildings where we're in warming permafrost, is the skirt around the exterior perimeter of the building. The quality of that, how it's put in, its extent, how it's sloped to eliminate water ponding under buildings. It's an area that kind of got attention in the past, but I think it needs a lot more focus. Ed, you got any ideas on that?
Oh, well, absolutely. If we were doing this job, 20 years ago, 25 years ago or so, that insulation would only have come out, 4 feet beyond the edge of the building. And now we would be looking at that insulation coming out, 20 feet. The insulation around the skirt of the building is going to buy you a lot of time on your building. And it's going to buy, it's going to buy some peace of mind for the owner. The other thing that, one of the things that wasn't brought up on this show, on this thing, but the membrane over the top of the insulation. Typically, we always would recommend a fuel-proof membrane, and that's what was recommended on this job, and I think you saw it in the plans earlier. And you figure a fuel-proof membrane is a waterproof membrane too, and our problems here appear to be all caused by water leaking. So there was something in that waterproof, fuel-proof membrane that probably wasn't working, whether it be a boot around a pipe or something of the sort. In some areas where, a lot of bush schools use fuel oil, and I have seen places where fuel oil leaks have caused like 6 inches of instantaneous settlement at a school because the polystyrene insulation will just dissolve. But if there's no fuel oil, people think we can just use something else. But if you have water, the water will find its way through those crevasses in the insulation and work its way down. And if it's not hot water, if it's just maybe just cool water, you might be able to not have settlement and just have a pingo in the middle of your school.
One thing to add to that, we got another question from Dennis Berry, and he says, was the waistline that extended below the insulation insulated at the time, and if not, is it now? And that's a great question. Some of the challenges, as Rick had mentioned with accurate as-built, is we went back through photos during construction of how the waistline was put together. Everything was intended to was intended to be above the, I'm sorry, I'm going to go to that, was intended to be above the insulation. You know, that once they got into the field, all was supposed to be in this area, much like a crawl space. All the waistlines were supposed to run into that. They didn't. So we got indication through photos that some of the waistlines, as they got deeper, especially in the center, right where we see a lot of the settlement, and then out towards the edges of the kitchen, were put into an insulated box, basically, where they dug a trench, they insulated with layers of our foam, and attempted to create a trench, if you will. I'm not sure how well that worked. It's the situation that we're in, and as Ed was mentioning, the fuel membrane, because the leak was in the kitchen, we believe that water did migrate. Our hypothesis is that it migrated above that membrane into the areas where you see the deepest settlement. Were also elements such as the concrete, the way the cold joints were poured, the way that we saw evidence of cracking at the gymnasium, and then along one of the major predicted cold joints that we got settlement that was showing through in areas that may not have been either where it was specifically, that would be the gym crack specifically, and then also where we thought we had settlement and didn't see evidence of it, where things were happening under the slab. I hope that answers the question. I see another one comes in that said, would it be better to have the liquid membrane at the insulation and all piping above it, then slope it away from the building? Yes, that definitely would be, I think, a lessons learned. The attempt was made to keep everything above the insulation, but the sloped portion of it, that might have been key. It's interesting, you know, being able to be involved in a project like this from the beginning. You know, we talked about waffle slab specifically to try and mitigate the potential of future settlement that we couldn't predict, and that was removed because of cost. Now, if we had spent that money at that time to do a waffle slab, we might not even be having this conversation or presentation, but that also may have meant that there was settlement that no one saw and could continue. There's sort of the other challenges involved.
What is a waffle slab?
Oh, sorry, for others. So if the waffle slab would have had basically an arrangement of cast-in-place beams throughout it so that it would resist settlement, the strength. It could have portions actually settle below and the slab wouldn't move.
So we wouldn't know that there was settlement happening until we had a catastrophic failure.
That would be the downside of that.
This is Rick Mitchells. One thing that we didn't address on, and we should have touched on, is the sequencing of events on the healing process. And reflect back to some of those photos of the samples from below the insulation and the in-place material. It's a very silty material, highly frost susceptible, lots of water down there. So as we begin to refreeze this rascal, there's and it did occur, a reheaving of the slabs come back up. So from the architectural sequencing standpoint, you want to make sure that you do the repairs after the heave is pretty much done.
I'll chime in on that. One of the fears that I had for the project is we were pumping a lot of cold into this ground. There was active cooling, then the refreezing naturally, and I was concerned. The comment I think I remember Rick making is it will heave, and it will heave in places other than where it settled. And while we were prepared for a lot more dramatic heaving, it really did return mostly in the areas that had settled, and we didn't. What I was happy is that we didn't end up heaving beyond our original elevations. We went back and surveyed after this drawing you're looking at, and while there's areas that we need to refill and re-level, it wasn't as dramatic as it was. The ground did refreeze and did come back up to some degree. We got another question of should we be installing temperature sensor strings under the slab now for existing non-slab installations. I think in this particular case they did add the temperature sensors as we showed earlier. The key in my mind is they have to be monitored and finding ways to make them simpler, faster, and easier to monitor, and then also verifying where those temperature readings are coming from, where do they exist in the areas you can't get to. And I think for everything I've heard from Rick and Ed for new projects, monitor everything, make sure you know where those monitors are, where are the temperatures getting, and who's looking at them. Somebody's got to be looking at them for them to mean anything.
Should we start monitoring beyond the footprint of the building?
Oh, you're talking to a geotechnical engineer. Not
Of
just,
course.
Yes, heck yeah.
Another point on the DDC system, yeah.
No, this is Rick. The topic of instrumentation, I think, is becoming, again, the threshold costs have dropped dramatically to do that. So the maintenance personnel that we have met, and frankly, the teachers and students at the schools, this is right in their wheelhouse to be able to help us as design professionals to collect data. And I just can't encourage that enough, and I think John, compliments to John and his team, the kids out there, it was just great to get it. They were engaged, he did a great job. It saved the owner a substantial amount of money, and it was a great, that relationship needs to continue, and we as design professionals should be fostering that. From the owner's perspective, you come to us with a real challenge. You have a lot of structures, some dating back into the Molly Hooch era, that you are now compelled to maintain those and keep those structures in a functional, safe manner. And we're here to help you do that, but it is a growing challenge for us. So I'll close out with that statement.
One thing that you mentioned, pulling this into the curriculum side of the school, the active monitoring by a science teacher sounds like something that they can make a curriculum, a STEM curriculum course out of, and then you'll get your data and they'll be able to teach their students about geotech and climate change and stuff like that.
The ANSIP program, I think, is a great vehicle for that, because we're reaching into the middle schools now. It's the perfect thing. There's nothing but pluses and upside to it.
And there's also some outreach from UAF
Right.
and stuff doing that same thing, where they're actually going into villages. And it may not be, it might happen in the school because the school is the nicest building, but they'll teach the whole village about how permafrost occurred, and if you know how something got there, you know why it's leaving, and how it's leaving, and stuff like that. And one thing we have, like for this school out here, is I've ordered a permafrost learning kit that's going to be heading out to the school this fall. So if John is still the teacher, he'll get to use it, or the new teacher will get to use it, and they can share it around the district. But we'll get that done for them.
Yeah, and that was a great point. That was one thing that we really were trying to do, is how can we not only help get the repair process going and completed, but also how can we involve the students here and use it as a learning tool, and which is the reason we're doing this presentation today. It's a super unique situation, a super unique facility, and we want to share that with anyone that's interested. So again, I think we're at our 1 o'clock. I want to thank everybody that dialed in, and thanks for attending and the questions and everything else. This has been great.
And just so you know, this webinar will be available on the Alaska Chapter A4LE's website in a couple weeks, and you'll also be able to find in that same location our previous webinars that we've been having. And again, if you have ideas for future stuff, that's where you can contact us, and we will be more than happy to make it happen and have another future webinar. So
Great.
thanks again
Thank
for
you.
everyone attending. We'll be in touch.